Welcome to Audio Gyan with Kedar Nimkar, a podcast that documents insightful conversations with Indian designers, artists, musicians, writers, thinkers and creatives of all types. Catch us on iTunes or visit audiogyan.com for more Gyan sessions. Here's your host Kedar Nimkar.
Today I have Sameep Padora with us on Audio Gyan. Sameep is a practicing architect and a principal of design studio sP+a in Mumbai. Sameep is in pursuit and encouragement of sustainable, contextual and innovative practices that arise from the site itself. He received his diploma in architecture from Academy of Architecture, went to study at SCI in Los Angeles and received his master's from Graduate School of Design, Harvard University in 2005. He's a member of academic councils of number of schools and is a member of National Technical Committee of Habitat for Humanity, India. And today we are here to discuss his approach towards context in the world of architecture. So thank you, Sameep, for giving your time, and it's a real honor to have you on Audio Gyan.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah. I'm planning to do this particular episode, this particular thing in 2 episodes. The first one, I'm trying if we can capture some philosophical aspects of what I've come up with as questions. And the second is more practical because you have like a huge body of work. Obviously, part of it is documented, part of it I'm guessing you would share today. So let's see how it goes. In the first part, which is more like a philosophical approach, I would like to start off with a more abstract question. In our previous conversations, you mentioned the word context, and which I've also gone through a bunch of articles online. So what does the word context mean to you, especially when you're designing, like when you are dealing with space design or architecture?
The thing is, context actually, the idea of context can be addressed at many levels. One is, of course, the immediate environment that any intervention sits in. That is a context. There is a certain amount of embedded knowledge that you are privy to because of your training, because of what you've done in the past, because of the knowledge networks that you actually have access to currently, which also generate in some sense a context of their own. Given the fact that the kind of world that we live in is connected at not just the physical state, but also through these various kind of digital networks, there is also a context that's emerging that might not necessarily be primarily about this geographical proximity. To kind of answer your philosophical question with another kind of philosophical twist, really what is context in today's time? Is it about just the environment? Is it also about this layer of networks that you're embedded in or you have access to? And I think the answer to that lies somewhere in between. That context itself has become very ephemeral. It's something that might also change with during a certain time of the day, time of the year, in the future, in the next 2 years, in the next 3 years, in the next 4 years, so on and so forth.
But this has to do, does it connect with architecture?
Well, architecture also inhabits a certain spatial let's say realm over time, right? So architecture itself does not stay static. Many times what happens is we design for a certain client, or we design for a certain understanding of what we are building, where we are building, but things change, So for instance, lots of buildings that were built in the British era historically for a particular reason are now being used for another purpose, right? So that program has changed over time. So everything, even the program itself, has a certain context. So what, for instance, there's this beautiful example in Delhi, which is Quli Qutub Khan's tomb, which was built out of pieces of an Indian temple. It was built as a tomb. The tomb, when the British were here, became the farmhouse of the British regent of the time. It was called Dilkush as a bungalow. So, it's strange that a temple becomes, a kind of tomb, then becomes a British regent's farmhouse. So, the context of that time is as important as the context of that particular place. So as time evolves, so does context, so does program. And I think architecture obviously is closely linked to this idea of program, right? I mean, what inhabits the space. So if you're able to, in some sense, design a project that allows for these multiple things to occur within this, within the spatial construct that you have, then I think there is something there to be coming. The cliche is to call it timeless, but it's not really that. It actually is responsive to time as time kind of goes by. So the context then is also temporal. It's not just spatial.
And do all these spaces eventually become museums?
That's a good question. One would like to think so, but I think one of the pet peeves that I have also about about the past is that we tend to see it as a moment frozen in time, right? That when we actually look at our heritage, we think about the heritage as this full stop that occurred 200 years ago, and now what's manifested at those 200 years ago is our heritage. But that's not how it has been, right? I mean, everything evolves, right? So even heritage has to be inhabited, it has to evolve into its particular time. It needs to change to accommodate, otherwise it's museumification, like you just said. Otherwise you might as well make a model of it, whether 1:1, 1:50, 1:100, and put it inside a building, light it up, and that's how your heritage is preserved. But heritage is truly preserved when it also is lived in. So I think that's very critical, that that you actually have this notion of a building not as something that is an image of what our heritage is, but it's really a heritage that actually allows you to evolve as well. I mean, if you think about it, as a country, we have a very interesting relationship with our history. I mean, of course, given today's time, it's even more exacerbated. But we either see history as within this kind of binary of what is extreme reverence. So you see a lot of our monuments are kind of walled off. Gardens have fences around them, or you don't get access. Or there is extreme apathy sometimes, whereby you actually see people scribbling on monuments, and you see in Baroda, a very interesting example that I actually went into this old step well that what a step well is, right? It's a water harvesting device, right?
Like I've seen pictures
exactly.
in Jaipur.
So outside the step well, there was a Syntex water tank, that was used to kind of hold water. So it's things like that. So we operate between these binaries of extreme apathy and extreme reverence, and which in both cases, heritage is really, unfortunately, just forgotten, or its background. So I think there's another argument to be made for heritage, or for this idea of the museum, the museumification, that things also can evolve. They don't have to stay static. So.
No, but when you are actually trying to bring or continue with this heritage, say for example, we can see certain parts of India, like the Tipu Sultan, the Mysore Palace. It's still owned by someone, and people still live there and do that, right? As opposed to certain examples in the West, where certain things are probably I don't know, I don't have an example exactly, but they are preserved and maintained in a particular way,
course.
As opposed to some forts in Maharashtra. They're just now khandars, right? So do you see any particular pattern, especially in India, where this context is still preserved? Or how the context has metamorphosized in the contemporary time?
So again, just to kind of talk about another cliche, we talk about how we are a kind of old civilization and things like that. And what's also interesting is that while as Indians, as a kind of culture, as a people, we exist both simultaneously in the past through our various kind of cultural kind of images that we carry with us, traditions that we carry with us, as well as in the future. And I mean, a lot of our kind of prayers are now coming through the mobile phone and stuff like that, and during pujas, my mom does that sometimes, my dad does that. So it's interesting that we have this very comfortable means of adjusting to both the past and the present and letting it exist simultaneously. However, just to talk about the fact that the forts, for instance, once we view them as relics, they will either have to be, let's say, going back to the earlier kind of question of context, they either will become acontextual in the sense that they're beyond the context of what that geographical location is, right? It's just then about the fact that this was a moment in our history that we now are going to preserve. Fortunately for us, we have a huge amount of history, the historical kind of heritage. But the problem is that with that scale of artifact, it's also difficult for us to kind of maintain everything. So the best way to actually look at it is, in some sense, maybe a way to adaptively reuse it. to kind of think about a different program for what used to be a fort, but need not be. Of course, the easiest thing to do is look at it as you could become a resort, right? I mean, lots of forts have been converted to resorts. But is there a way that we can also look at institutional programs, cultural programs that would inhabit these spaces rather than just being purely hospitality? So maybe there is an argument to be made for a sensitive readjustment of that spatial nature to allow for new programs to inhabit.
So maybe like a well-designed, say, David statue is maintained and it's under security, there's lighting, there's everything, like it's properly, it looks like a place to be and experience it, right? As opposed to, I don't know, maybe Raigad is not that way maintained.
Right.
So you're saying that different types of programs can be designed around this,
right.
than looking at as like just one.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I also we all know how extreme museumification also has resulted in let's say museum moments, right, where if you actually have to go see a famous painting, whether it's
Mona Lisa or whatever,
whatever. I mean, it's whether it's Da Vinci or it's any other Michelangelo. I mean, the number of tourists that you have to kind of contend with, the number of people taking pictures, the crowds in front of a painting. Really, the context of that painting is no longer something that lends itself to the experience of the painting anymore. So even preservation doesn't, or kind of maintenance, like you're saying, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to contextualize that work of art, in some sense. So it's also. So there is that kind of other aspect of it as well. Is it just then about creating a culture of consumption? That this is really just about that, being able to consume it in a particular way, as opposed to looking at it as being a part of a lived-in experience, like you're saying, the Raigad Fort. What if the Raigad Fort had, let's say, a community center that inhabited a certain part of it, right? So what if it became an institutional program? And if it was sensitively done, would it be then would you be able to also maintain the fort because people are using it every day and then it doesn't fall into disrepair? If something goes wrong, people are looking at it, and so on and so forth. So maybe there is a different way to actually look at this idea of heritage and context.
I'm so like keen to know your thoughts on how has your work started doing this, but I'll keep that for the next part. And what have been your observations about how dynamic or versatile the context has been, at least in urban India now? Now, if we can segue to urban India.
Yeah, so
any observations?
Yeah, sure. No, we are actually doing an entire research project currently where we are looking at what we are calling non-types. Non-types for in our kind of imagination are buildings that escape the definition of through the formal mechanisms of the development plan of building code. So whatever defines the formal city, as in defines what is being constructed by developers, by private individuals, as buildings that are taking permission from the BMC and then kind of being built, as opposed to the buildings that in some sense have existed despite all of this being in place, despite formal mechanisms. And I'll give you a small kind of example. In Dadar TT, there is a little, a place that sells certain goods, above which there is a hoarding. And inside the hoarding, there is a guy who actually has his house. So now he's been there for, God knows how many years, 30, 40 years. But, there have been 3 DPs that have gone by since. And, everything around it has changed. Buildings have become taller and stuff. But this still, kind of resists the formal planning mechanisms of the DP in some sense. So there is an entire city that exists between the formal city. And the question that one has to ask oneself also then is, which context are you building in? Which is the context of urban India? Which is the context of Mumbai? Is it the formal towers that you're kind of responding to? Is it the city in between? And again, there are no answers to this because there are certain the kind of dynamics of the city are driven by so many various agencies that the context itself is layered by some some contexts that are very evident, which might be the geographical context, but an entire mechanism of semantics in terms of building codes, an entire mechanism of other kind of relationships, power structures that define the kind of the use of a particular project and its final ability to build it. That context actually is, in some sense, is completely irrelevant within the city of Mumbai in some sense, no? Because the way that we are taught context in college, the way that our imagination of context is completely ill-equipped to deal with the actual mechanisms that work within the city of Mumbai. I mean, take the coastal road, for instance. So, yeah.
I think I don't know how, I have to listen to this again to comprehend it more. But I think it's then mainly where you're coming from, right? That sets the context. Because there's so many things to be observed in the same thing. It's not linear.
Right.
And it's not even in a web form. It's multi-layered web.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
I think, what you're probably saying, string theory probably comes closest to expressing the complexity of context within urban India, or at least Mumbai.
So it depends on the person who wants to fix things or who wants to make a small change here and there. So the person where he's coming from establishes the context on his own, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think the only change that you can make is small. I don't think a big change is really within the capacities of, people like us who are not willing to get, let's say get into politics, for instance. No? I mean, I think if you really want to make big change, you have to kind of get into the political kind of machinery of what operates the city, the country. As professionals, our capacities are limited to very, very kind of specialized areas of engagement, which also is important because for a large period of time, maybe 30 odd years, or maybe even more, 35, 40 years, the professional really had no role in the imagination of the city. We were really kind of looking at these segmented kind of parcels of land which we were building for. This was primarily developer driven, as you might already have understood. But I think now, seeing the way that our cities are kind of manifesting or turning out, if we are not able to take on a little bit more responsibility as professionals to be able to also talk about what we think is right or wrong at within these land parcels, I think we'll lose further kind of mandate, and it'll be it's already too late in some sense, but I think we can recover some ground if we act fast. So
since I've started this audio again and I've been observing and also listening to other type of content, I think designers now have to extend, obviously in the online space where I design products, the boundaries between product design and product management is blurring, right? Because you are a designer, you need to understand the context entirely and then contribute to the overall experience. I think that envelope will further push of us as designers that we should slightly get into the economics also, because politics is, I think, the next level, maybe understanding just the economics of how a country works or how a particular society works. Right. It's just
so you're absolutely true. You're absolutely right. I mean, when I studied at Harvard, some of the courses that I took were actually on to do with macroeconomics and finance and things like that. Because really, what I kind of figured as an architect, I had a certain amount of training, which was great. It gave me a kind of specialized skill, but it didn't give me the skill to understand the structures that actually allow for these projects to actually happen, or any kind of development to occur or not occur. So I think that was in some sense, our kind of education makes us sensitive, but it doesn't give us enough tools to actually be able to action some of that sensitivity.
So this is slightly taking a different track, but what, in the same context of context, what is the process to identify soul of a project, right? So if you're working on a particular project and you understand the context, or you define the context rather, this is where what I'm looking forward towards that. So how do you identify the core of it? What are the parameters on which you think this project will thrive, not just for you, but as a society or as civilization at large? Yeah,
so I think a couple of things. I really like the fact that you mentioned context of contexts. At what point do you stop contextualizing? But I think what's interesting also is the fact that for me personally, I don't know about the soul of a project, quite frankly. I mean, I've grown up, reading of course, listening to people like Doshi sir and Charles Correa, and who had this very amazingly articulate way of defining these various ephemeral understandings of space and building. And what interests me more, however, is about real value. I mean, how can you physically improve the living environment within a building that you make? So, for instance, in the Jetwan project, which is a small community center that we did for the sP+a group as an outreach program in rural Maharashtra, what we did was we ended up using mud rolls on the underside of the roof. Now, typically, when you actually look at, you think about what a finished project is, you want to see, like POP, clean ceilings, and so on and so forth. But this is actually the exact reverse. We're using mud rolls to actually do the underside of the roof. But what it does also, it creates excellent insulation. So during the summers, when the temperature outside is 43 degrees, it's at least 5 to 6 degrees lower inside. So for me, that value of the performance of a building, of a certain part of a building, is far greater than, let's say, maybe finding the soul of the project, in some sense. So I think for a very long time, we've all, as architects, as a kind of architectural pedagogy, we've talked immensely about this idea of the soul of a project and let's say the qualities of a project that are very important, of course. But I think we have to go back and now start addressing also this understanding of performance, and not at the expense of let's say the soul of the project, but in some sense augmenting that with a kind of performative understanding of the project. So, for instance, where a user can come back and say that, yes, it transformed me emotionally, but, I felt cooler sitting inside that building, even though it was completely, it was 50 degrees outside, it was only 43 degrees inside. So I think that for me is now becoming a lot more important. And I also think when you're able to make that kind of difference, which is easier to comprehend for the general public, you also, in some sense, inform the general public about the capacities of architecture as a discipline. That the discipline has a capacity to make a physical difference to the environment. It's always had that. It's just that, we've in some sense we've digressed by talking a lot more about the qualitative aspects rather than the quantifiable aspects of the discipline. So I think, quantifying this is important, and by this I don't mean the real estate that you actually get when you buy a house, but it's really the kind of the experience inside. Yeah.
I don't know whether I should get into this, but there's मतलब एक हिंदी में बोलते हैं ना कि अध्यात्म तब आता है जब पेट भरा हो, right?
That's right.
So is it that because the way India it is right now,
right,
you intentionally focus on these aspects, or maybe Charles Correa or Laurie Baker focused on these aspects, or this is the way to approach?
I feel this is the way to approach.
You know what I mean, right?
Absolutely.
Eventually we'll get into the soul part.
Absolutely.
But right now you are in the like paid bharo types.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, doing that, trying to find that level of efficiency. Of course, you make mistakes sometimes because you're constantly pushing the envelope. But I think the pursuit of that kind of efficiency is extremely important for the sake of not just the project, but also for the profession in some sense. So,
okay. So it has very little to do with India, what position we are in right now.
Oh, it has absolutely everything to do with what position we are in right now. I mean, this is the fact in why India, the world. I mean, if you look at countries like India other countries as well, what you see is that a straightforward thing, about resources, the way that we are consuming our resources. Is there a way that our buildings that we actually build can consume less? What if they are built entirely out of waste, for instance? No. So, is there a way that we can actually look at efficiency as being a judge of how good the building is, rather than it just being about that transformative moment of that soul impacting transformative moment? Of course, if that happens as well, that's a bonus. But I think the first datum should be that the building is extremely performative.
Oh, interesting. Sameep, I would like to conclude this part with one last question. Like, what is your long-term vision about future of architecture in India? Again, in terms of the context word may not be relevant here right now, but what's your thought process? I mean, what do you imagine when you look at India, or at least the body of work you have done? How will it pan in 2050 or 2060? What are the dreams that you get?
Yeah, the dreams actually, honestly, I'm not so, I don't dream that much. I don't sleep that much actually. But no, just as a kind of, what I'm really more interested in is, in terms of the future of architecture, I'm really interested in whether architecture has a future. Architecture as a discipline, as we have imagined it thus far, does it actually have a future in building society, in building a better world? I think what my dream in some sense would then be that architecture as a profession also evolves. It's no longer about, a client coming to you to design a project and you're doing a project. It's also about in some sense, a realization that these are the kind of projects that are needed, and now you go around kind of figuring out how to make these projects happen. So maybe the format of practice, architectural practice, has to evolve into maybe 10 or 15 different versions. There is an example that I give a lot, which is about this essay by A.K. Ramanujan, where he talks about, is there an Indian way of thinking? And which he reframes every time he kind of uses that phrase by emphasizing different words. So sometimes the question reads as, is there an Indian way of thinking? As opposed to, was there ever an Indian way of thinking? So it's about past, present. Is there an Indian way of thinking? As opposed to, are there many ways of, thinking like in an Indian sense? So my real kind of interest, or my dream, if you like the way that you put it, is whether we can reimagine the profession to be, kind of cloning itself in ways that would do different things. So there would be some guys who'd be able to look at infrastructure projects like the coastal road and say that, this doesn't work in the format that it does, but we understand how, various mechanisms actually put the coastal road into place, both strategically and physically. And we know how to deal with this. So this is the kind of architectural practice that will allow them to address, the coastal road, for instance, or to readdress it. So that is really a kind of dream where architecture as a profession has evolved into something that now can take on the challenges that our cities face, that our country faces, and address it at the level that the project needs, and not just at the kind of training that we've received.
I think I'll take some time to
Sorry about that.
No, it's completely fine. Yeah. Okay, I think this is a good note to end this. Obviously, there are a lot of things to be generally spoken about, but given my understanding about this field in general, I would like to conclude on this note. And obviously, the second part, I'm looking forward to more practical aspects of architecture and your work as well. So Thank you for giving your time, and it was lovely talking to you.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. Catch us on iTunes, Savan, Stitcher, or any podcasting app you use. Do rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Stay tuned for more Gyan on audiogyan.com. Till then, bye.